Guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, May 31st, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about Senator Joe Manchin from the state of West Virginia today announcing that he is switching political parties, but not exactly. Leaving the Democratic Party and now joining as an independent in the U.S. Senate, but caucuses with the Democratic Party. And generally speaking, I want to cover this because I think it will have exactly zero impact on the outcome of this upcoming Senate elections, presidential elections, whatever it might be. This has an overall net zero impact on the way we should look at politics in the modern age. But I think it's a unique point of interest because Joe Manchin, for a long period of time, has been hinting that he wants to leave the Democratic Party, and now, in his final term in the U.S. Senate, has actually decided to do so. Now, Joe Manchin has been serving in the U.S. Senate since 2010. He was first elected in a special election where he was the governor, where he appointed somebody under the simple terms that they would not run for the eventual seat so that he could instead run for United States Senate. 2 years later, he was elected to a full term by the West Virginia residents on the same ballot that Mitt Romney, the Republican governor of Massachusetts at the time, decided to run, or not at the time, but the nominee for president decided to run for president, easily won the state of West Virginia, but Joe Manchin ran up the numbers, won over 60% of the vote, and then came his election in 2018, where he won against Patrick Morrisey, who is actually now the Republican nominee for governor in this state. Joe Manchin defeated him by roughly 3 points, and then came the 2024 Senate race. And initially, Joe Manchin filed paperwork very early on to run for re-election. There was heavy expectation that he would in fact jump into the race until Governor Jim Justice, a Republican who used to be a Democrat, a lot of interesting party switching and race, moving around on both sides of the aisle here. But it's very interesting because Jim Justice had initially been a Democrat elected to the governorship, elected in 2016, switched to the Republican Party in 2017, and decided to run for Senate in 2024. And so in a way that scared away Joe Manchin, Jim Justice, as a very popular governor across the state, easily won re-election back in 2020. And now this time around, Joe Manchin, instead of running for re-election, decided to back out of the race. And so since then, his political relevancy has since dropped. He became someone of major prominence in 2021 and 2022 when he held up a number of key and crucial votes for the National Democratic Party. He held up a number of things related to raising the minimum wage, abortion rights, abolishing the filibuster, a bunch of different moves that National Democrats were hoping to get through, even with a very slim majority that meant that every single vote, including Joe Manchin's, mattered with ultimate importance here. Joe Manchin could single-handedly hold up the U.S. Senate, and that's exactly what he did. And so came 2024, and many National Democrats were hoping in a way that he would decide to bow out of the U.S. Senate race. But we knew that he would probably be the only Democrat who would be able to even make this race competitive. And so when he decided to lose, West Virginia became an immediate Republican pickup. In my most recent Senate election prediction, you can see here that Joe Manchin, his seat right here in West Virginia, is solid red. Ruby red because Jim Justice is going to win this race by roughly 30 to 40 points. There is no consideration in the slightest that West Virginia will be competitive in this upcoming Senate race, and that's for good reason. West Virginia was one of the most partisan states in the 2020 presidential election. Right here, Donald Trump won 69% of the vote to Joe Biden's 30%, nearly a 40-point advantage over the incumbent president back in 2016, too. You can also see that Donald Trump won this state by 42 percentage points. And so West Virginia, in many ways, has become one of the most conservative states in the entire country, something that you really find that no Democrat would be able to overcome. All of their House districts are Republican, their governorship easily Republican, every elected statewide official is a Republican now, and the state legislature is one of the most lopsided we have in this nation, with Democrats in some chambers having single digits in terms of overall seats across the state itself. And so West Virginia comes in as a state that has become extremely, extremely conservative, and it was just simply too much for Joe Manchin to overcome. That even if he did decide to run against Jim Justice, he would end up losing, not by 30 to 40 points, but by anywhere by 10 to 20 to 30 points. And so ultimately, his bid for re-election would be in vain, and he loves to cite this statistic here that he has never lost an election that he has decided to run in. And so I don't think he was going to allow potentially a final term in the U.S. Senate stop that, especially against a very popular Republican governor. Now, Joe Manchin switching political parties, I think, is, the main focus of this video. And so you've already got a lot of the background and a lot of the discussion, about what he has done in the U.S. Senate, why he's made a name for himself, why this is even in, major news media. Anytime that a senator decides to switch political parties, it of course matters a lot. But Joe Manchin switching to be an independent who caucuses with the Democratic Party is essentially doing exactly what Angus King, Bernie Sanders, and Kyrsten Sinema have been doing for a very long period of time. And so I think that's where we really need to group them into here. I think it's very interesting, too, on two opposite ends of the spectrum on the Democratic side, you have Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, who self-identify as the most centrist, in some cases conservative members of the Democratic Senate delegation. And then you have members like Bernie Sanders, who self-identify as extremely left-wing, progressive, in some cases in years past, identified as a Democratic socialist who now serves in the U.S. Senate as an independent who caucuses with the Democratic Party. And so I'm not going to lean into this too heavily by talking about horseshoe theory, but I think it's very interesting if you're just looking at it from that lens. But ultimately, now that Joe Manchin has left the Democratic Party, he has fulfilled, seemingly, his lifelong goal of being an independent in the U.S. Senate. He joins the ranks again of Kyrsten Sinema, Angus King, and Bernie Sanders. And just to give you an idea of what this looks like visually on the map here, I've decided to characterize the Senate map based on Democratic and Republican caucus, which means it actually includes the independents who caucus of the Democratic Party as blue states here. So Maine, Vermont, Arizona, and West Virginia. And so I'm actually going to just characterize the states that now have independents who caucus with the Democratic Party. Angus King in Maine, Kyrsten Sinema in Arizona, Joe Manchin in West Virginia, and then you have overall here Bernie Sanders in Vermont, which the state itself doesn't show the little dot here to recognize an additional Democratic seat here, but the other seat is currently held by a Democrat. And so that brings us to a total of four independents in the U.S. Senate, none of which identify with Republicans. And you actually start to see this becoming more of a consistent theme amongst Democrats rather than Republicans. Even when Arlen Specter, if you recognize his name, it's because he lived in infamy after he switched over in 2009 from being a Republican elected senator from the state of Pennsylvania, had been serving in the U.S. Senate and in Congress in entirety for a very long period of time, decided ultimately under President Obama's victory in 2008 that in 2009 he was going to switch political parties to not be an independent who caucused with Republicans, but instead become a Democrat. And that was the last time we saw some very major news come out of party switching in the U.S. Senate. And so a lot of politicians sort of saw that as, in some cases, opportunity, a way to build a name for yourself, build a brand for yourself, and completely reject a political party that you might have once identified under fully, through and through, that you no longer do. And I think that's exactly what both Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin sought to do in this effort. I also think, too, that they did this very much for political capital. The idea that they are leaning so heavily into independent thinking, free thinking, centrism, that they're leaving their own political party that got them there in the first place. And so when Kyrsten Sinema first made this move here, it really didn't shake up much about the U.S. Senate, except for the fact that she might decide to run for the Senate seat in Arizona as an independent. That is literally the only speculation that came out of her switching to being an independent who caucused with the Democratic Party. For Joe Manchin, I don't know what his endgame is here. On one end, I'd like to think that he believes he has a political future in West Virginia, just not as a Democrat. And in a way, he might be right. The voters in West Virginia don't dislike Joe Manchin. He's a popular senator, he was a popular governor, and quite frankly, he represents a lot of what West Virginia residents believe in, except for the fact that he identifies with a political party that gets less than 30% of the vote in a presidential election in this state. So being an independent does serve him a significant advantage electorally. The question is, where does he want to go electorally? On my end, I don't know what his next steps are. He's already ruled out a run for governor against Patrick Morrisey. I mentioned his name earlier on in this video because he ran against him in 2018 and lost the Senate race there, then decided to run for governor, ultimately ended up winning. The Republicans didn't want him to win. Jim Justice endorsed somebody else, and yet he ended up winning the nomination and will easily win the general election. On the other end of things, I think Joe Manchin, who at one point in time floated the idea of a presidential bid, might be remaining in politics, just not necessarily on a West Virginia level. Might try to become a major political commentator or a political figure, somebody who ends up in a Trump administration because he's an independent, who may be caucusing with the Democratic Party, but ultimately seems to be publicly rejecting them, citing partisan extremism, citing whatever it might be. What I see from this move here is that it was done with the intention of building out his brand, continuing to add to this legacy that he seems to have set for himself as someone who Democrats see as being obstructive, but some independents believe to be bipartisan. Some independents believe to, see him crossing the aisle and being aligned with more than just his core Democratic base. And so while Joe Manchin very much might believe in being an independent who caucuses with the Democratic Party, I cannot but recognize, and I think I've said this multiple times now, that this will have exactly zero impact on anything happening in politics. And I rarely ever understand why politicians do the things they do unless there is a concerted effort from one side of the aisle pushing them one way, or really a real reason for them to do the things that they do. When you take a look at our Senate forecast for 2024, the chances at which the Republicans win West Virginia isn't going to change no matter what party the opposing candidate was going to be. Even if Joe Manchin himself decided to run as an independent here, the voters here know that a Joe Manchin re-election means an additional seat for Democrats in the U.S. Senate. They were fine giving it to him in 2010, 2012, and 2018, but that was practically the last time we were going to see Joe Manchin in the U.S. Senate, or quite frankly, any Democrat from that state. West Virginia is not a battleground, and the voters there don't want anybody but Republicans in their elected constituency in Washington, D.C. And so unfortunately for Joe Manchin, he just simply isn't a Republican. And he's rejected multiple efforts over the past 2 decades to switch political parties. Ever since he was elected to the U.S. Senate, and even when he was governor, Republicans went to him and said, switch over and we'll give you any committee assignment that you want. We'll hand you anything in West Virginia. We'll make sure that you are propped up as a legend in the state. They got to Jim Justice. They couldn't get to Joe Manchin. And so now that he's joining as an independent, I think this also might just be the last big pushback against the National Democratic Party that we are seeing from Senator Manchin. I think he's felt very alienated by members of the Biden administration, very alienated by members of Democratic leadership. And I think the reason for that isn't because they have any type of personal, reason to be disliking each other, but rather because of the legislation that National Democrats set up as a priority, and that Joe Manchin himself sets as his, office's priority, the West Virginia residents' priority. He does what he believes, and these are his words. He says he does what he believes is best for his state. National Democrats and West Virginia residents probably have a lot less in common than many of these other Democrats hailing from other battleground states, Democratic states, and so that's where it becomes a problem for Joe Manchin himself. And so I think that may be the reason why you are finding that even in his last time in Congress, he is making this as a decision, maybe for his own political benefit, either in a future Republican administration, future in West Virginia politics, but also to reject maybe what the Democratic Party has said and done to him, but also too, when he says partisan extremism, there may just be a part of him too that sees Republicans as the problem as well and wants to be done with this two-party system entirely. And so I think that's maybe more of what we've seen with people like Angus King. We've seen with people like Senator Bernie Sanders, because I think those people, despite being much more left-wing in terms of voting, party record, and also just simply on their individual beliefs. Angus King, sure, more of an independent than Bernie Sanders, but both of which self-identify as left-wing. Their policy points very much left-wing in modern America. And so I think for those people to be grouped in here, I think they very much see the reason for it, not because they are too left for the party and Joe Manchin is too right for the party, but maybe because they don't believe in this idea of the two-party system. They recognize without caucusing with the party, you lose all effectiveness in a political branch, right? Joe Manchin would have no committee assignments, no type of benefits from being in the U.S. Senate as an independent alone, and neither would Bernie Sanders, neither would Angus King, and so they have to choose the Democratic Party. They have to caucus as a Democrat or a Republican, depending on where they want to go. And so I think that's where you're starting to see that overlap here. But I've started to see, and the reason I made this video, and I think, I wish we had talked about this a little bit earlier on, but, I've started to see some of the speculation here that Joe Manchin is abandoning the Democratic Party because he no longer wants to be affiliated with the brand. And while I think that in some realities, there are some Democrats too, maybe in the South, maybe in West Virginia, that were what we call ancestral Democrats that wouldn't identify with the modern Democratic Party, that would more identify with the modern Republican Party. I do not believe Joe Manchin is that. You've seen it in a lot of what he has voted for and what he has done. Fundamentally speaking, Joe Manchin has voted party line roughly 80% of the time, 90% of the time, depending on what it is. When it comes down to confirming nominations from the Biden administration, you're talking 90 to 95% of the time. When it comes down to votes, on major party votes, you're talking when it actually gets to the floor, because he's willing to let it go through, closer to 100%, but in terms of overall, 80 to 90%. And so Joe Manchin is not a Republican, and I think none of this should be taken in a way that I think Republicans are trying to spin this as something that is a major benefit to the GOP. Because there is no voter who's going to go out there and say, I'm voting for Republicans because Joe Manchin switched to be an independent. There are no voters out in West Virginia that are going to change the way they look at a Senate race, House race, governor race, presidential race, simply because of Joe Manchin, unless he is that candidate in the race. This is a nothing burger. It's very similar to what happened with Kyrsten Sinema, where the only hype and the only conversation was around whether she was running for re-election instead of the fact that she switched political parties. This might make for a great Associated Press headline, but that's all it's going to be. It will not change anything about the Senate composition, about who's on what assignments, on what priorities the Democratic Party has, because at the end of the day, as an independent who caucuses with the Democratic Party, he might as well be a Democrat in the eyes of the chair, in the eyes of Senate leadership, in the eyes of the American public, because it does absolutely nothing, accomplishes absolutely nothing, and the only reason we find politicians doing it are for personal interest. Whatever that might be, whatever those feelings or beliefs might be as well. That's all things that we can speculate on, and Joe Manchin can choose to reveal or not. But in terms of analysis, in terms of electoral takeaway, I know it might seem stupid to make an entire video talking about how this means nothing, but I think it needs to be constantly reinforced that despite major conversation, major headlines here, you can see even Joe Manchin gets his own tab here on the Associated Press. It means nothing because it will have zero impact in the way that Democrats govern, legislate, and continue to move forward. Because Joe Manchin, at the end of the day, he's still, a caucused-in Democrat and will still be part of that voting bloc, will still be there until January 2025 in the same exact capacity that he was expected to prior to this announcement. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for 2022 did not mean to go back in time there. 24 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.